Hello, Rune Scholar, wherever and whenever you are. I'm the Modern Erilar. Today, let's do a second requested deep dive, this time into the runes used in the 72 islands off the coast of Caithness in Scotland, called Orkney. The date of original Scandinavian settlements in Orkney is unclear. Orkney Inga saga suggests that Harald Hårfagr claimed both Shetland and Orkney in 875 of the Common Era, though the archaeological evidence suggests major transformations in architecture, diet, and portable material culture in the mid-10th century. The Earldom of Orkney, a Norse territory relatively independent of the Norwegian crown, was founded sometime between the late 9th and late 10th centuries, enjoying the height of its power in the 12th century. Instead of a clear delineation between the Viking and medieval periods in Orkney, James Graham Campbell and Colleen Beatty suggest instead an overlapping chronology, where we consider Orkney to show coexistence between Picts and Scandinavians between about the 9th and the 10th centuries, to be Viking between the 9th and the 11th centuries, and then late Norse between the expeditions of Magnus Barelegs after about 1050 and Orkney's transfer to the Kingdom of Scotland in 1468. David Griffiths has suggested that the material culture in the earliest Norse settlements in Orkney shows a mixture of insular and Norse culture, possibly suggesting settlement by the mixed Hiberno-Scandinavian group already in the Irish Sea area, prior to a later assertion of Norwegian overlordship. Where we can ascertain an Orcadian dialect, the people who left us runic inscriptions seem to have spoken Old West Norse, which was indicated in 37 out of 56 inscriptions. Latin was the second most important language in inscriptions, appearing, for example, in inscription OR23, which renders a phonetic version of a portion of the Lord's Prayer. James Knirk suggested that these phonetic spellings of Latin phrases indicated relatively nascent Latin literacy in comparison to runacy in Old Norse. I mentioned 56 total inscriptions, and that's a huge corpus, considering that we know of 22 from elsewhere in Scotland and 19 from England. Chronologically, Orcadian inscriptions covered the range of Nordic settlement, though most of the reliable dating clusters in the 12th century. No single complete runestone survives, but we know of inscriptions on an interesting variety of artifacts. Inscription OR11 has the first 6 runes inscribed on a bear's tooth recovered from the Broch of Bearsey, now housed at the National Museum of Scotland, and a copy of which is at the Orkney Museum. The runes were cut with double lines, which is almost unique within the Orkney inscriptions. Dating the find has been problematic, and any isotope analysis like carbon-14 would be both inherently destructive and not that illuminating for this particular time period. But the form of its O rune, this 4th rune here, that was no longer common in Western Scandinavia by the early 11th century. And then we also know that brown bears, or grizzlies for those of you who live in black bear country, those had also gone extinct in the British Isles during the Roman period, so the tooth must be an import. Runes also appear on both visible surfaces of a tiny lead amulet from Coys, and I say visible surfaces because it's folded in half once, and it can't be unfolded without breaking it. Barnes reads this side shown here as Iras abi, and a second side as the Old Norse phrase unithik, both of which are phrases intended to banish something. This may represent, if it is both Latin and Old Norse, a combination of these two languages on the same artifact. And if you recall episode 13 on the Baltic Islands, both languages were used for amulets there as well. 12 runes appear inscribed along the outer circumference of a hemispherical bone spindle whorl from Bury, representing most of the runes of the futhark sequence, with the F and U runes missing, and the end of the futhark in a unique order. One B rune has been cut with double lines like the runes on the bear's tooth, but otherwise the runes are cut with a single stroke. These runes are mostly short-twig younger futhark, so rune 2 has been transliterated by Leoslind as a Y, though Freund finds it to be less certain. The twig of the rune that Leoslind interprets as a second N, rune 11, crosses the stave fully. So in her transliteration, she indicated that as a capital letter to indicate the difference. Dr. Andrea Freund thinks that the inscription starts here after the third rune, and her interpretation of this 11th rune is as an A sound, shown here. And as I mentioned, she found rune 2 to be less certain. This particular H rune, rune 8 here, that was common later in Iceland, where the majority of these finds date from the 15th through the 17th centuries. But the short twig S, rune 12 in this inscription, is unlike the full height sol rune typically found in Iceland during that period. And the Yr rune, if that is what it is definitely of a Norwegian type rather than Icelandic. So instead of concluding that there was a single influence behind the Orcadian runic tradition, by which I mean it comes entirely from Norway or entirely from Iceland, it may be better for us to understand Orkney as part of a greater North Atlantic milieu, showing influences from multiple vectors. Orkney also has a full futhark inscription, which oddly ends TBYNU. This futhark was one of 33 runic inscriptions carved at Maeshowe, a prehistoric chambered cairn and passage grave that was entered and vandalized by Vikings. The cairn is estimated to have been constructed around 3000 BCE and was built of local flagstone. Its visitation was recorded in Orkney Ingasaga. Earl Harold set out for Orkney at Christmas with 4 ships and 100 men. He lay for 2 days off Grimsey, then put in at Hamnevy on Frossi, which is now mainland Orkney. On the 13th day of Christmas, they traveled on foot over to Firth. During a snowstorm, they took shelter in Orcahauger, and there 2 of them went insane, which slowed them down badly so that by the time they reached Firth, it was nighttime. Unfortunately, the saga tells us nothing more about Orcahauger, but fortunately, a woman named Leif, the Earl's housekeeper, left us a clue that Maeshowe is Orcahauger. Her inscription reads, Jorsalfarar brutu Orkhaug, which translates to Jerusalem travelers broke Orcahauger. And a second traveler then, in this inscription that I'm showing here, tells us Jorsalmen brutu haug thena, or Jerusalem men broke this mound. The runes are very faint in this photo, even in the raking light that can usually illuminate what the actual rune carved is. But I have stared at it in a high resolution copy, and this particular inscription is Sinistergrade, which is written from right to left rather than from left to right. And many other inscriptions at Maeshowe are read from left to right. So both of these do appear in Maeshowe. Michael Barnes connected the various Maeshowe graffiti to Earl Rögnvald's crusade, which was contemporary. Rögnvald and his retinue spent the winter of 1150 and 1151 on Orkney on their way to the Holy Land. But Andrea Freund points out that it could also have been King Sigurd's crusade that left the graffiti 30 to 40 years prior, and that we don't know if the Jorsalafara were on pilgrimage or on crusade, or whether they were inbound or outbound. If the travelers there sheltered during a snowstorm, the chamber must have been accessible with a minimum of effort rather than completely filled with rubble, and it must also have been sufficiently well known as a landmark to have been mentioned in Orkney Saga without any other explanation of where it was. Based on the available linguistic and runological evidence, the Maeshowe inscriptions date to between 1125 and 1175. None of the runes stylistically predate 1125. They may have been added piecemeal over a period in which Maeshowe's interior was freely accessible, rather than all at once in 1153. Due to their informal nature, the Maeshowe graffiti are likely to be closer to colloquial Old Norse than some of the other sources that we have from the 12th and 13th centuries. As I described in episode 3, one of the other interesting features of the Maeshowe runes is the prevalence of twig runes, a type of runic encoding where the rune itself is indicated numerically within the futhark by the number of twigs on specific sides of the central stave. The number of twigs on the left side of the stave is the 8, which is simply the grouping in which the rune typically appears within the futhark order. The twigs on the right side of the stave then indicate the position of the rune within the 8. If a visual of this would be helpful, feel free to revisit episode 3 for a refresher. I discussed it pretty in depth there. This inscription, which is Farer 8, also called O.R. Barnes 9, consists of 2 lines of plain runes, which are pretty normal here, and then this line of twig runes here. And this coded line can be transliterated as 2, 4, 3, 5, 1, 4, 2, 3, 3, 6, 3, 5, or Arliker, which Barnes considers to be the name Erlinger, which could be the name of the person who may have carved the runes. The use of a cipher to encode runes demonstrates runic literacy, or runacy, because the rune writer must know the position of each rune in its 8, as well as the order in which the 8s appear. In inscription O.R. Barnes 20, the rune carver described himself as that man who is runester, or most rune-skilled west of the sea. And the phrase encoded within the inscription is these runes. The cipher is the same as another twig rune inscription on runestone OR4 at the Ring of Brodgar, approximately 3 kilometers from Maeshowe. None of the encoded twig runes on Orkney seem to encrypt any information that is intended to remain secret, or convey information which may require a special level of security. So the usage of twig runes may indicate, as K. Jonas Nordby has suggested, that cryptic runes were used to demonstrate runic skills by creating puzzles for others to solve. So now that we've seen several examples of inscriptions from Orkney, what makes Orcadian inscriptions unique? What runes are Orcadian? Well, we've already seen the whorl from inscription on spindle whorl OR24. The corpus in this part of Scotland also features both dotted e's and dotted cairn, but no other dotted runes survive in Orkney. Dotted e's appears in inscription OR3 from Stromness on a steatite spindle whorl, where this rune appears within the word that is likely the word reist, which means to write or to raise runes. Not all inscriptions use dotted runes, however, even where we would expect them. OR1, the stack root disc, has an inscription which reads Cairn os thorn, or God, but the Cairn rune shows no evidence of the dotting that might indicate the diacritical mark that would differentiate the G sound from the K. It uses the K rune to indicate both the G and the K sound. Inscription OR11 from Tukoi Hall uses this rune for O, this rune for A, and this rune for an ah kind of a sound. And this mirrors usage at Maeshowe as well. So differentiating vowels this way can be pretty uniquely Orcadian. However, usage of this rune for a short ah sound appeared well prior to 1100 in Norway, possibly by 1050. Other inscriptions show additional vowel variants, like this rune for an kind of a sound, and this rune for u. Inscription OR10 from Orfir on mainland Orkney features 2 R runes of a Greenlandic type, runes number 4 and 7 in this inscription. These are called Greenlandic runes because 21 out of the 38 examples of this kind of R rune come from Greenland, 13 from Norway, and 2 from Iceland. This specific R rune is unique within the British Isles, and the carver was not necessarily a Greenlander, but must have been familiar with this rune, possibly because Orkney is a natural stopping point on the route between Norway and Iceland and Greenland. We've already covered runes from Norway and Greenland, so maybe let's stop by Iceland ourselves in our next episode. Thank you for reading the runes with me, the Modern Erilar.